Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. In today's session, we will understand routing in single page applications and to be specific, React Router DOM. So before we dive into understanding React Router DOM, it's important to understand how routing works or navigation works in general in a traditional browser applications. So let's understand that a little better. In a typical multi-page web application, every time we click on a link, for example, you clicked on a home link, the browser sends a request to the server for a new page. And here is how the sequence looks like. You requested home. The browser sends the request of home, querying whether it's available or not to the server. The server responds that yes, home is available and sends you the HTML document, home.html. So the entire page reloads and the browser renders the new document which it receives, which is home.html, and starts parsing its JS, HTML, CSS, whatever comes in response. Now, in this process, each navigation reloads the entire page. While it works fine for traditional applications, it can cause poor user experience in modern and dynamic web applications that we create as of now. To overcome this, we have single page applications and client-side navigation. So how does client-side navigation works? In modern web applications, the ones like we built in React, we often use the single page application model. And how it works is the browser loads a single HTML file initially. So you requested the root route. Initially, the server responded with all the JS files and everything. That was the landing page of your application. Now with that landing page, the browser loads a single HTML page. And the JavaScript that comes with that initial landing page takes over to manage the UI without reloading the entire page, which is called JS routing or client-side routing, the module that we see here before the server. This client-side routing is what allows single-page applications to change the URL and content without refreshing the page. So whenever now, for example, you're requesting the home route, the request goes to the JS routing or client-side routing framework, for example, React Router. It gives you the home.tsx and it is rendered onto the same page without any reload. So to understand how React Router DOM takes over this responsibility, we need to understand it a little better and some of the core modules that are shipped with the library. So let's dive into React Router. The various aspects that we will understand today is how declarative routing works. For that, BrowserRouter, HashRouter, MemoryRouter. Then programmatically also you can create the routes using their programming equivalent. So create BrowserRouter, create HashRouter, create MemoryRouter. So create BrowserRouter, create HashRouter, and create MemoryRouter are the methods that were introduced to provide a more programmatic way to define routes. This is useful when we want more flexibility when handling data loading in our applications. And then there are two hooks that we will primarily use useNavigate to enable us to trigger navigation programmatically, and then useLocation, which will give us the information of the current location that we are on. Now let's go through the documentation of React Router DOM before diving into the code example and implementing some of that. Now this here is the home page of React Router. As we can see, at its core, React Router DOM is a library that allows us to manage routing in a React application. This enables declarative routing, the one that we saw in the previous video and we will see right now as well, where we define routes using JSX and the library takes care of managing the application's URL. Then you have dynamic routing. Dynamic routing is based on the state or context and routes can change dynamically. Now React single page applications load a single HTML page and then React Router DOM will let us handle the URL changes without reloading the page. It does this by manipulating the browser's history API. So how does this work? Internally, it is listening to the browser's history API. So there are two key events, push state and replace state. Push states adds a new entry to the browser's history stack. So whenever you're navigating to a new route, a push state event will be triggered. When you have replace state, it replaces the current entry in the history stack without creating a new one. So whenever you're replacing something, it will trigger a replace state. React Router DOM needs to know when the URL changes, so it can update the UI accordingly. And how it subscribes to these changes is listens to the pop state events. Whenever user navigates using the browser's back or forward buttons, it listens for the pop state event. This event is triggered whenever the active history changes, allowing React Router DOM to detect URL changes made by the browser itself. When navigation happens within the app, we use the elements that are provided by the React Router. For example, a link component is available to trigger the routing. Then you have your hooks like useNavigate hook, useLocation hook. So useNavigate hook gives you a function using which you can trigger a navigation. So whenever we trigger navigation using these functions and components, it gets notified of the programmatic URL changes and programmatically updates the history of the browser using push state or replay state when it re-renders the appropriate components. And internally, React Router DOM keeps track of all the defined routes and their corresponding components. Every time the URL changes through any of the mentioned events that we talked about, push state, pop state, replay state, it matches the new URL against the route definitions and renders the correct component. Now let's dive into the code example and understand React Router DOM and its offerings. So here we have our application. In this application, our server is running right now and we will be able to access this in localhost 3000. Let's have a look. And here we can see we have our landing page, which is defined as product list page available. So we see the root page of our application is product list page, and product list page just shows you a text of product list page. That's it. And that's what you see. The next route that we have is a product ID, which will show product details page. This ID is a dynamic route parameter. This can be any value. So if I go to product/3, this matches the appropriate route pattern that we have, and it shows us product detail page. And similarly, you have cart. So whenever I go to the third route cart, it will show you this cart page. Now for this, we are using BrowserRouter. And as we mentioned, if we use link elements and other elements that are offered by the React Router DOM, we will be able to trigger the navigation. So let's create a basic placeholder header for now and see if we can see some routing happening. For that, let's add a header. So this, we will use navbar coming out of React Bootstrap, and let's provide background as dark, variant as well, dark. Now with this, we also need to include nav, another component coming out of React Bootstrap, and inside nav, we will have our nav.link. Now nav.link component allows you to have an extra prop, which is as prop. You can pass any element and that element will be used to render the link. So here we will use the link coming out of React Router DOM. As we can see, link coming out of React Router DOM would be used here. And now you would see appropriate errors as well. So it tells property 2 is missing, because if you look at the documentation of link element, the documentation of link element signifies that so this 2 prop is your route which you want to navigate to. Let's go to root. So home, great. Now let's duplicate it 2 times. Another route will take us to cart, and this one will take us to a product. So product ID of 200 just for navigation testing. Sorry, we don't need this colon. Product details. Saved. Let's see if it comes up on our application. Here we can see we have home, cart and product details. Now let's click on each of them. So product details takes you to product details page with product ID 200. Cart takes you to cart page and home takes you to product list page. As we can see, we are not reloading anything. We are not reloading the page. So let's look at the JS file. Are we loading any JS file when we change the route? So because these are JS components, I'll refresh. When your application loaded, a bundle.js was fetched. Now when I'm switching over the page, there is no additional call that is going. So routing is entirely client side and we are not loading anything again from the server. Now why using these links is important. Let me replicate one of the nav link and I will remove this as attribute. So now it will use default anchor tag for routing and cart default anchor. So now, even though we are still going to the same route, here we are intentionally bypassing React Router DOM. In this case, the React Router will not be invoked and the normal redirection, that traditional redirection that we talked about initially will take place. Let's have a look. Now, as we can see, bundle is loaded once, and if we use any of these routes, nothing loads again. Now I'll click on cart default anchor and we can see it reloaded the page. I'll preserve logs so that you can see. On clicking on any of these, it's not loading it again. But here, every time I click on this, it's reloading the bundle. So the request, whenever we are triggering, goes to the server. React Router DOM is not aware of these requests and it will not prevent the page from reloading. And that's what is happening. It's a hard reload that's happening on the page. It's reloading all the content of the page again and again. And that's why it's recommended to only use the components that come out of React Router DOM whenever you're doing any routing with React Router DOM. Another key call out, these link elements rely on browser context being available to trigger the redirection. In case routing context is not available, it will throw error. Just to showcase that, what I will do, I will move everything inside a fragment because as per JSX rule, only one node can be returned. Now I will take this entire header and move it out of browser router. So now we can see our browser router does not encapsulate the link. Now when links are invoked or rendering, we will look for a router context and they will fail to render. And this is something that you can see on your page as well. See, cannot destructure property of this use context as it is null. So base name and other routing related utilities are not available, and in console you will see the error is occurring in the link component. So whenever you see these sort of errors, it means that you forgot to wrap the link elements and other navigation related logic inside any of the router providers. So these not only initialize your router, these also provide context to the components that are under the pre-node. So let's move it back and the error would be resolved. And here we can see if I refresh the page, the console will be clear of any errors and the routing will continue to work. Now let's understand what is browser router. So browser router is the most commonly used component for routing. It uses the browser's history API to handle the URL changes as we discussed initially. What is happening here? The browser router is initialized and listens for changes in browser's URL. We have defined various declarative routes. So these are the routes which we are supporting out of the box. One is the landing page route, then your product route and the cart page route. Whenever the route changes, it checks in all the routes, and if it matches, it shows you the appropriate component which is configured for that route. Now, if you want to create this entire routing structure programmatically, you have this createBrowserRouter utility available as well. Let's use that. So const, this gives you a router as an output. So router is equals to createBrowserRouter, and it is coming from React Router DOM. Now this takes in an array of config as input. And what is the configuration? Two of the most important config points are path, where you want to redirect to. I want to redirect to home. And which element do you want to show? The element that I want to showcase is my product list page. Same as what we defined in the route below. Now let's duplicate this. Your cart will take you to cart page, and your product 256 will take you to product details page. Let's save it and let's use this router. So for that, temporarily, I will go ahead and remove everything from here, and we will have a router provider which takes in a router as a parameter, and the router that we created, we can pass that as a parameter and it will initialize the same routes. Let's have a look at our application. Here is our application. Still cart available, landing page is available by default, and the route that we created, we did not make it dynamic. Let's make it dynamic ID. My bad. Let's go back to product and wait. This will load product details page, as you can see. So the routes are still working exactly the same structure, but now you can create the routes programmatically. And that's where createBrowserRouter and other utilities come in. Now let's remove that and dive into understanding the next part, which is HashRouter. HashRouter and similar implementation is available for createHashRouter as well. So create HashRouter instead of BrowserRouter in case you want to create the routes programmatically. Now let's go and understand when do we need HashRouter. So in case your server does not support URL rewriting. So URL rewrites in a server for React application ensure that all requests are redirected to index.html file, allowing React Router to handle the client-side routing, preventing the server from returning 404 errors for non-root URLs. This enables seamless navigation between routes without reloading the page. But if that sort of configuration is not possible in your application, you can use the HashRouter. In HashRouter, the key advantage that we get is it uses a hash in the URL to denote it is a client-side route. And the browser ignores the hash part whenever it is sending a request to the server, ensuring the server always gets the base as the requesting document. This comes in really handy. Older browsers and legacy systems also utilize this. Browser router that we saw depends on an HTML5 history API, but if you don't have history API available, you would have to use something like a hash router. Some of the drawbacks of hash router are the URLs are a lot less clean, as we can see. There are certain SEO limitations that come out of it, and it's not as modern. If your environment supports the browser router, it's generally preferred for cleaner URLs and better integration with modern web APIs. So to summarize, hash router is really useful when we don't have control over server to configure the URL rewriting rules, when we need to support older browsers or environments that do not support the HTML5's history API, And when we are hosting the app on static file hosting services, where server-side routing is not really handled. For example, you uploaded a static bundle onto SharePoint and you still want to have the routing available, you can use HashRouter in those cases and your site will work perfectly fine. Now next, we will look into the memory router. Let's replace HashRouter with MemoryRouter. So here I updated everywhere to MemoryRouter. And now let's have a look at our application. We can see the routing still works, but you don't have a visible identifier or browser updates happening at the browser level. So MemoryRouter is particularly useful in scenarios where we don't want to manipulate the browser's URL. Instead of storing the navigation history in browser's address bar, MemoryRouter keeps the history in memory. And this makes it ideal for non-browser environments. For example, unit testing, certain UI-specific use cases. So MemoryRouter is also ideal for environments where the app does not run in traditional web browser, such as mobile application, React Native applications. In these cases, mobile apps or desktop apps don't have a typical browser URL to manipulate. Routing logic will still be necessary to navigate between different screens, but there is no need for browser-based routing like BrowserRouter. And then whenever you want to embed an existing React app in the existing website, then also we can use MemoryRouter because you're not conflicting with any of the routing capabilities that are there in the website, but still have the internal routes available whenever the embedded app is functioning. And as we can see, you have MemoryRouter and the programmatic equivalent createMemoryRouter, which works exactly the same. The key features of MemoryRouter that it offers in-memory navigation. Second major feature is that we can pass initial entries and initial index to this one. So it has support of initial entries that yes, this is where our site is starting from. So initial entries would be pointing to the entries that we already have defined, and initial index we can set it to 1. Now if we refresh our page, you will see cart page comes by default because as per initial entries, we have set the index to 1 and it will always take us to cart. If I set it to 0, it will again take me to product list page. And here I'll refresh. You see product list page comes up. So this also comes in really handy when we are testing the routes. And the third major feature is it has no browser history dependency. So since navigation doesn't rely on browser's address bar, it can be used in non-browser environments, as we already talked about. Now, to summarize, MemoryRouter is very useful when you want to do testing, when you want to run your application in non-browser environments, and when you want to implement internal routing or embed a React application in an existing web application. So it's a really lightweight and effective solution in all three scenarios. Now with this, we have more or less covered all the three major routers that we wanted to cover as a part of our React Router DOM. Now let's look at two of the hooks, useNavigate and useLocation, and how do we use them. So for that, I would go inside one of the component pages. I'll go inside cart page, for example. I want to create a button through which I want to programmatically navigate to product details page, for example. So what I can do, first, let's use the useNavigate hook. Const navigate. This will give you access to the navigate method. Use navigate from React Router DOM. Now we have this. And now let's define a callback handler. So I'm taking to product number 404 whenever we click on this, and let's replace this with a button. So we'll return a fragment because only one node should be returned, h1 cart page, so that it's really calling out that it's still on cart, and then button coming from React Bootstrap on click handle route navigate to 404 product. So here we have a button with the route navigation. So navigate gives you capability to navigate to any route that you want based on certain user actions. And let's do one more thing. Now we don't need MemoryRouter. We will replace everything with BrowserRouter now. So Control Shift L to select all the instances matching BrowserRouter. It does not support initial entries. We'll remove those. We are not using programmatic navigation as well. I'll remove the router to clean it up and delete. Now code is cleaned up and we also have our cart page created. Let's refresh and go to cart. We have cart page, navigate to 404 product. If I click on this, you see, it takes me to product 404 and loads the product details page. So the routing, the navigation logic is still working and we are using React Router DOM's useNavigate hook to do the same. Now let's understand useLocation as well. Const location is equals to useLocation, and useLocation imported from same React Router DOM. This gives you access to location. And for now, I just want to console log it so that you understand what location information we are getting out of it. Location contains location. So to understand location, I will add some additional parameters to URL and see what all things we get out of it. So what I would do, we would definitely navigate to cart. So by default, it tells you, okay, you have your path name as cart. Good. Now, after this, what I want to do, I want to add some search parameters. For example, you're on a search page and you triggered a search. So search param is equals to query, and there's another search parameter, query2 is equals to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This will add the search information onto your URL. And we see that location is now giving you search as well as the path name for this one. And if there is hash-based routing or hash-based system implemented, or you have hash-based anchors in your project and you want to get the information of which hash you're on, this is custom hash. I've added a hash as well. And as we can see, now hash information will give you anything that's associated with the hash. Path name will give you the current router based path where your application is on. And then search will give you information about the search parameters. So it is a full-fledged object which will enable a lot of the use cases in your application. And that's why it was important to understand this. Now with this, let's cover one final topic before we wrap up, which is the NavLink component coming out of React Router DOM. Let's go through the documentation to understand what exactly is NavLink. So here, NavLink is a special kind of link that knows whether or not it's active, pending, or transitioning. So this is something which we want to have in all our enterprise applications or the apps that we are developing. Whenever you select a link, whenever you're on that page, that particular page should be highlighted. A visual means to identify an active link should always be there. And that's why it's always preferred that in projects that we are developing, we use NavLink instead of links. And right now, since Bootstrap by default uses the same classes active, pending, we don't have to introduce this custom class name override. But in case you're using a framework that uses a different class, you have created a custom class that you want to showcase when you're active, you can go ahead and add this class name, which will give you these props: is active, is pending, and based on those props, you can return certain strings, which will be applied as the class to your component. Let's update our code now. So here, what I would do, I would start using NavLink coming from React Router DOM. Please ensure that you're using the one from React Router DOM, not from React Bootstrap. So NavLink, then 2 would be the same. We are going to root node for now, and we are loading home here. Now you will observe that adding this has introduced some styling inconsistencies in our application, and we'll fix that as well. But first, have a look. You see, this home is how it should be looking, but the new link that we've added is coming up with a different style. Why is it so? Because it is missing this NavLink class, which gives it the default behavior that we need in a nav bar. So let's add that class. Now with this, you would have home, and it's highlighted because it's marked as active, as you can see. So NavLink is already doing what it's supposed to do. It's identifying you're on the current route and marking your route as active. And now let's replace all three with NavLink. Don't worry, in future sessions, we'll remove this hard-coded 200 and we'll dynamically navigate to the required product, but just for demonstration purposes. And now if we see, if I go to cart, the cart is the highlighted page and product details is the highlighted page. So it highlights it appropriately. Now with this understanding of NavLink, we have covered everything that we wanted to cover in React Router DOM. So now you understand what are browser router, memory router, hash router. Why do we use them? Why do we wrap our NavLink or links inside the routers? How do we define the routes, both programmatically and declaratively? And with those, we also understand how do we navigate programmatically to other routes that we have defined in our application. We also understand how we can use location to get some additional parameters that are a part of our location object. Now with this, you are more than ready to implement client-side routing in your application. There are some additional advanced topics which are there in React Router DOM, but they are on a use case basis. So for anything that you want to implement which is outside of these, you can refer to the documentation, and probably we will cover in our future courses when we implement some of those aspects. But this is a great starting point. Hopefully you were able to complete all of these. If not, we will re-implement the routes and header in the next session in the shopping cart application. Hopefully this was very clear and you were able to understand it. As usual, in case you're stuck anywhere, you're having trouble understanding a concept, please drop a comment and I'll try to be of help where I can. Thank you for your time. See you in the next one.